Thank you for joining us around the fire. For more information or to make a donation, please visit randomactsnetwork.com. Now, want to hear a scary story?
The Taylor's home was a split level on a quiet street, and Laura spent most of her time downstairs. The main area consisted of the family room with a large box TV and the seating area, with one side offering a hallway to her bedroom and the laundry room, and the other consisting almost entirely of glass windows. The view was mostly of the trees leading into a forest preserve, and she loved the way the light filled the room during the day. She only wished they'd gotten around to putting up blinds for the nighttime. Laura wasn't one to scare easily, but there was always a noticeable shift when the daylight disappeared and the glass windows became a black wall. Even the dim light of a lamp and the TV's glow were enough to obscure the view on the other side. But she'd gotten used to it over time, and occasionally she was able to sneak out through the sliding doors without her parents noticing. At least, they never said anything if they had. It was a stormy night, and Laura was drinking popcorn from the bag while her family attended some event without her. She watched a terribly edited broadcast of an old horror movie and enjoyed the sounds of the rain. Just in case the power went out, she lit a candle next to her and pulled the corded phone from the wall to the side table. She began to drift to sleep and turned off the small lamp before sinking deep into her favorite chair. Just before she'd let her eyelids fall completely, lightning struck and the yard was filled with light. Laura froze in terror as the thunder followed, but it wasn't the low rumble that gave her chills. Now she looked again to the black wall of glass before her. But moments ago, she swore she saw someone there. She began to reach for the phone, but strained her eyes again on the spot outside. She hated the thought that she was on full display for whatever could be out there, but still she leaned forward, squinting, focusing, waiting for any noticeable movement. A fresh bolt of lightning hit close, and this time there was no mistake. A tall, hooded man stood directly on the other side of the glass, a stained ski mask on his face. In his hands, he held a long, dirty butcher knife. Laura screamed and dove under the blanket. She knew the doors were locked, but was he going to break in? Staying covered, she reached outside of the covers for the phone and dialed 911. She whispered that a man was watching her from the backyard and that she was too scared to move. The dispatcher sent a car immediately and said the best thing to do was stay where she was. After a few moments, the woman on the line asked Laura if she could check if the man was still there. She didn't want to leave the safety of the blanket, but the dispatcher promised the police were close and she needed to give them an update. Crying, Laura lowered the blanket once again. She had to wait for lightning to strike, she whispered. They sat, each listening to the other's shallow breaths as they waited on the storm. Maybe it was just a prank, the dispatcher suggested. Was there a neighbor kid nearby? There was probably nothing to worry about. But the latest flash of lightning revealed the man once again, and Laura yelped in terror. As she pulled the blanket back over herself, the phone cord tangled with the candle, knocking it to the floor. Wax splattered everywhere, and the flame went out. She remembered the remote cradled next to her in the chair, and suddenly slid her hand outside of the blanket, pressing the power button. The television fell silent, and the room was pitch black. Now they were on even ground. Slowly, she lowered the blanket from her hairline, past her eyebrows, stopping at her nose. Now the entire yard was clear enough to see, and without a doubt, there was nobody there. As she noticed the first flicker of red and blue lights on the leaves, she felt a tinge of embarrassment. Had she fallen asleep? Had there been a man outside at all? There were voices along the side of the house, followed by flashlights zigzagging on the grass, and Laura finally let the blanket fall as 2 police officers came into view. They shined their lights around, saying something into their radio, then, through the windows, finding Laura. One officer spoke into the radio as Laura thanked the dispatcher and hung up. But before she could stand, lightning filled the skies once again, illuminating both the officer's terrified face and the man's horrifying reflection in the glass from where he stood directly behind her chair. The officer's patrol car peeled out of the driveway as they rounded the corner at the front of the house. The man had gotten away, at least for now. Laura remained in her favorite chair, under her blanket, a long, deep gash across her throat. Deep in the heart of a large hospital was a ward for those long forgotten by any loved ones. In this decaying wing, 3 old men shared a narrow room with just one window at the very end. The man who had been there the longest, Harold, had the bed nearest to the window. Years ago, he'd been in a terrible accident, and he was left to die in the hospital. At some point over the years, Harold fell unconscious and never woke back up. He laid there below the windowsill each day, breathing in and out quietly, never opening his eyes. In the middle bed was George, a chronically ill man pushing 80. He had a weak heart and many troubles with mobility. Yet he was known for remaining endlessly cheerful despite all of this. He enjoyed the light of the window from his resting place, but couldn't see anything but the sky above. George's positive nature could really bother the man in the 3rd bed, furthest from the window. Richard was quiet and always grumpy. He was known for saying that George was happy enough for the both of them. From Richard's bed, he could barely enjoy even the light from the window. He spent his days frowning and avoiding George's attempts at conversation. Eventually, Harold passed away in his sleep. The nurses somberly came in to remove his few belongings and change the bedding. This ward would be ceasing operations soon, they mentioned, and they would not be taking any new patients. The nurses shifted George to the bed by the window, and then Richard to the center mattress. Even though Harold had always been silent, the room felt especially still with an empty bed. After the nurses opened the curtains and left the room, George enthusiastically welcomed the view. Overjoyed, he told Richard what he saw. People walking by in the square, a group of young, beautiful women. There was a traffic jam outside of an ice cream parlor, and a police officer walking by. A group of children chased each other on the sidewalk. In a matter of moments, Richard and George felt more connected to the outside world than they had in years. Though it pained him even to speak or smile, George made sure to describe what he saw to Richard at least once a day, sometimes even more. He was weak and tired, but he assured Richard that he was happy to do it. George told Richard of the falling rain and growing puddles in a thunderstorm, followed by clear skies and a stunning rainbow. He chuckled at the businessmen, always in such a hurry, and laughed with the playing children. As the days went on, Richard wanted more and more to see it all for himself, but he knew he'd have to wait for George to die for that to happen. Of course, he didn't wish for George to die, but he didn't mind the idea of having a room with a view all to himself. How many more chances would he have in life to set his eyes on a group of beautiful women? After a few weeks had passed, Richard awoke in the middle of the night. George was tossing and turning in his sleep, groaning and mumbling. Occasionally, he'd have an attack in his sleep, and he kept an emergency bottle of pills on his nightstand in case a nurse couldn't get to him right away. Richard set his eyes on the bottle, feeling the hairs on the back of his neck stand up. He looked to George, still squirming in his sleep, and reached out towards the bottle. In a quick decision, he purposely knocked the pills to the floor. The sound startled George awake, who quickly gasped and clutched his chest. Richard had pulled his arm back under the blanket just in time. It felt like his own heart would explode. George attempted to sit up but couldn't, awkwardly leaning towards the side of the bed. With great effort, he swung his arm to the nightstand. His hand slid around the table, knocking over the water glass and bumping into the lamp. Richard watched George's hand stop moving as his eyes landed on the pill bottle that had rolled across the floor. Then they shifted, locking with Richard. George knew what Richard had done. And that's how he died, tilted toward Richard's bed, eyes wide open and glaring directly at him. Richard didn't sleep that night. He looked past George's frozen stare at the closed curtains. Tomorrow, he told himself, he would see the world. The next morning, the nurses cleared George's things and moved Richard to the bed by the window. With 2 empty beds, he suddenly felt quite alone. But that won't matter, he thought. The world outside would keep him company. Finally, he would see for himself all the things George had described. As the last attendant left, George asked her to open the curtains. She obliged, and the room was filled with the light from outside. George turned on his side, taking in the view. But all he saw was a brick wall. It was the evening of the high school dance, and Catherine was wearing the dress she'd worked on all year. She didn't have the money to buy something new like the other girls in school, but her talented hands created something much better, something one of a kind. The red, sparkling fabric was stunning against her skin, and she knew her crush, Matthew, would simply have to take notice. But after she'd blushed her cheeks and straightened her hair, she was greeted by her mother in the kitchen, wearing a heavy scowl. "You're not going to the dance," she said. "Dancing is for the devil's children, and you dress in the color of sin. Go upstairs at once, change your clothes and wipe your face. Then come down and make us something to eat." Her mother returned to the front of the house, where she was likely reading or sewing, and Catherine stomped up the stairs to her room. She'd told her mother all about the dance, even showing her a glimpse of the fabric the day she brought it home. But sometimes it was like she had 2 different mothers entirely, and tonight she had the mean one. She dampened a cloth and raised it to her cheek, but paused. It wasn't fair. She'd waited years for this dance and spent hours on her dress. And who knows who Matthew would dance with if she wasn't there? For the first time in her life, she decided to defy her mother. She gathered her things, walked down the stairs and out of the house without saying a word. With a burst of adrenaline, Catherine sprinted towards the school gym. The dance had already started, and she wanted to enjoy every moment possible. She could hear the music from outside as she neared the doors and finally entered the building. In a fantastic moment, it felt like every single person in the room stopped and looked at her standing there in her shimmering dress. She was so used to going unseen. She looked through the crowd for Matthew, but couldn't find him. Her girlfriends were all on the dance floor with their dates, so Catherine stood near the punch bowl as she continued looking around the room for her crush. A few other boys came up to her and asked her to dance, and she bathed in the euphoria of turning them down. After all, she was waiting for someone. Finally, she spotted Matthew with a group of his friends, and their eyes locked. Her breath caught in her throat. But this was the moment she had been waiting for. His eyes remained on her as she made her way in his direction. She could tell he was shocked by the beauty of her dress. But when she asked him to dance, he turned the color of the fabric. The others around him laughed, teasing him for being asked to dance by a girl. Catherine stepped to the shadows of the gym, suddenly regretting the choices that led here. She'd never admit it, but she'd made the dress for him. Now it was for nothing, and she couldn't bear to think of what punishment awaited at home. From the darkness of the crowd, a gorgeous young man appeared next to her. She'd never seen him before. He had shiny jet black hair, a perfectly tailored suit, and piercing eyes that captivated. And he turned to Catherine and asked her to dance. She couldn't even manage to say yes. She only held out her hand for the taking. He led her to the dance floor, and the music suddenly erupted in volume. They danced together, and she moved with an ease she didn't recognize. She'd always loved to dance, but never had much talent for it. She followed the beautiful man's lead, very aware of the hundreds of eyes on them. The man spun her around and around. The others in the gym clapped and cheered, and he spun her faster. She began to lose her breath and tried to step out of the spin, but he spun her even faster. The floor seemed to melt beneath her feet. She tried to focus on her own limbs, but couldn't. It was as if they moved on their own accord, and her feet grew hotter and hotter, and yet he spun her faster. The crowd cheered and whooped and applauded, and finally she was spinning so fast that a cloud of dust formed around them so thick that they could no longer be seen by the crowd. The music returned to its normal level, and the dust fell to the floor, revealing the beautiful man standing there. But Catherine nowhere to be seen. He took a bow for the crowd, and, fully enamored, they applauded with vigor. And then he disappeared too. The devil had come for one of his children and spun her all the way to hell.
Dancing with the Devil, told by Terri Lynne Hudson.